Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This week we're going to be talking about the Quayside. If you don't know, the Quayside is the riverside area within Newcastle upon Tyne. This was based around traditional industries. As with many heavy industries in the UK, this went into decline. The regeneration of the Quayside was first proposed in 1963 in the Newcastle upon Tyne development plan. But the area was recognised as going into decline in the early 1920s. Now, 100 years after this, in 2020, we look at the overall Quayside development and see if it has been successful and sort of what went on in this situation. The starting point for all this is in 1927, the new Tyne Bridge, or commonly known as the Tyne Bridge, was constructed. This bypassed the entire Quayside area. Before this, all traffic crossing the River Tyne would have to go down towards the Quayside area and then come back up the Tyne Gorge. But in 1927 this all changed, as now traffic could now cross the river at high level, getting from Gateshead to Newcastle. This road formed the A1, which is the main road between Edinburgh and London. The Quayside had lost many businesses and few people actually lived down there by the river. What few businesses remained struggled to survive. The building stock was outdated for modern use. People did not visit the area as the area used to smell of sewage. Sewage was a major problem in the River Tyne, as the Tyne was one of the most polluted rivers in the country of the UK. This is probably relating back to its industrial heritage as well as factors as there was no interceptor sewer. In 1958, some 270 sewers poured 35 million gallons of untreated sewage into the river in 1 year. A massive investment was made over 10 years, mainly in the 70s, to make an interceptor sewer along the banks of the Tyne. This collected sewage and took it to a treatment plant at Howden, further down the River Tyne. After this, the Tyne has since become a fine salmon river. The Wilfred Burns plan in 1963 proposed regeneration of the Quayside. This is where we see a sort of a formal approach to the regeneration. Wilfred Burns was a planning officer for the city and worked closely together with a political leader, Dan Smith. The aim of this was to create a Brasilia of the north. If you don't know, Brasilia was sort of the new capital for Brazil, sort of introduced a lot of urban planning topics and a lot of new ideas that was meant to make a really modern city. The same was intended for Newcastle. They wanted Newcastle to be a modern city with modern buildings and pedestrians and traffic to be separated. The details of this plan are a topic for a whole other video, as the divided plans have left their mark on the city still now. The proposed solution was to create a new city centre office scheme called All Saints Offices, named after the church it surrounds. The All Saints Church was completed in 1796 and was unusual due to its oval shape. All Saints is a real icon on the Quayside, it's a landmark to Newcastle still to this day. It was threatened with demolition in the early 1960s. However, it's perceived this new office scheme would help find a new use for this building. The first phase of this office scheme was completed in 1971. The concept aimed at building the strength of the city centre down towards the Quayside by developing 650,000 square foot of offices. This proposed scheme would have led to a majority of the buildings being demolished, including listed buildings. This has included the exchange buildings, which are located just underneath the Tyne Bridge. The design of this new office scheme would have been the same style and materials throughout. This was a concrete panel look with glass windows. The scheme was promoted by Newcastle City Council and Ravensoft Properties. This scheme failed as 2 of the 3 buildings in the first phase of the All Saints scheme were adjacent to the approach to the Tyne Bridge. As with the creation of the central motorway, the traffic around here drastically increased. This led to issues of noise on the office's property. This obviously affected their market value as well. Poor pedestrian access was also another factor of the failure of the scheme, as the central motorway relied in this section on underpasses to connect to the city centre. These were an undesirable way of accessing the city centre, and they also lacked the ability for step-free access to the city centre. The developer of the scheme did not make any money as they struggled to get tenants for the first few years due to these issues mentioned. The stock market crash of 1975 and the later phase of the scheme never came to be due to the tough economic climate. This obviously for the developer was bad, but the fact this has sort of retained the exchange buildings is obviously great to keep that listed building. The next notable feature of the Quayside's regeneration was Kell Cross House. This is a 17-storey building, which is still one of the tallest on the quayside. This has an attached link block at quayside level. This was 50% under construction during the market crash of 1974-1975. This stood as a derelict shell for 2 to 3 years before it was eventually completed in 1979. The decline of the quayside continued further, even with these various attempts of office development to save it. Another iconic scheme that came out at this time as part of this overall regeneration using office schemes was the Tyne deck. This was an ambitious plan to build a suspended deck above the River Tyne that would link Newcastle and Gateshead. This modernist vision of Newcastle's future would have seen Newcastle and Gateshead no longer separated by water, with a large concert hall in the centre. This scheme also shows the plans for another high-level crossing of the Tyne, which would have formed the Central Motorway East bypass. As with many parts of this whole Brasilia of the North scheme, this was never started. Following on from what were very ambitious schemes to regenerate the quayside, what followed was a much more subdued plan. As the All Saints scheme had earmarked many listed buildings on the quayside for demolition, in the minds of the authority of the time and the general planning landscape, conservation was a secondary issue, and the main issue was growth and new business, no matter what this would take. In the late 70s, conservation issues finally came to the forefront after the loss of many famous structures both on Tyneside and around the world. Due to the office market remaining dormant, further banking and property crash occurring in 1975. Due to the sloping All Saints site, building costs on this site were very high. This scheme was formally abandoned in 1980 as further decline in the quayside continued. As the private sector was unwilling to invest in the quayside, the decision was made to promote the building of a new Crown Core on quayside frontage. The authorities had to be persuaded that a difficult quayside site was better in the long term, compared to a cheaper site the government already owned on the fringe of the city. The foundations of this new law course was laid in 1988, with local architects Napa completing the scheme in 1990. The City Council also tried to encourage residential development down the quayside. A large site of 1 acre, previously part of the All Saints scheme, was offered to the market around 1980. There was little interest from the major house builders. Cecil Yill, a privately owned property development company, reportedly paid £1 for the site, where they proposed to build 50 house and flat units. They were also awarded a significant grant to carry that scheme, as viability studies indicate the scheme would be unprofitable without such assistance. This led to a mainly low-density scheme. This was 2 to 3 stories of a traditional layout, but more modern design. Sales of this place was slow. The area was not served by schools, shops, or other relevant social or economic infrastructure. Owing to the slowness of the market, the developer failed to make acceptable profits. The increased building costs of a difficult site led to the scheme never being completed as envisaged in the original plans. The quayside's residential market did not really exist in the 80s. The Prince's building on Queen Street, just in front of All Saints Church, was renovated in the 80s. This was formerly an office building that was unused and owned by the City Council. Minimal financial consideration was paid for this building. This was completed in time for the Tall Ships event of 1986.
In July 1993, more than 2 million people flocked to the riverside from the region and beyond for the Tall Ships Festival, celebrating the vitality of our young people. The corporation took pride in helping to make the celebration memorable for the Northeast and our European visitors. For those watching by the rivers, the new Tyneside and Wearside were on show as a forward-looking region, decks cleared for action.